She had a positive pregnancy test in one hand and a divorce text on her screen. 3 years of marriage, a penthouse in Manhattan, a husband who never came home on their anniversary. And when he finally reached out, it wasn't to apologize. It was to end it. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part? Someone had been using her name, her identity, her life, to hide millions in dirty money. And the people who put that money there? They needed her gone. Stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. PA. The pregnancy test was still on the bathroom counter when Evelyn heard the elevator chime. She didn't move. She stood in the doorway of the master bath, still dressed in the blue silk she'd spent 40 minutes putting on. The kind of dress that required 3 attempts with the zipper and a specific pair of heels that made her calves ache after 20 minutes. She'd worn it anyway. She'd made the reservation 3 weeks ago. She'd even called ahead to confirm the champagne, non-alcoholic. She'd quietly changed it to sparkling water that afternoon because of the test, because of the 2 lines that had appeared before she'd finished washing her hands. She'd been planning to tell him over dinner. The elevator chimed again. Then the front door opened and she heard the specific sound of someone who was not Adrian, a building attendant, a concierge, her imagination. And then nothing. Just silence and the low hum of the city 42 floors below. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it the way you look at something you already know is going to hurt you, and you look anyway because some part of you is still hoping you're wrong. We need to talk. Not tonight. I'll have someone reach out about next steps. That was it. No period at the end, just those 2 sentences and then a contact card for someone named Philip Rask, attorney at law, with a Midtown address and a title that read Family and Asset Division. Evelyn set the phone face down on the marble vanity. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. The blue dress, the hair she'd blown out herself because their usual housekeeper had called in sick, the mascara that was already threatening to do something unforgivable at the outer corners of her eyes. She looked like a woman who had prepared for something that wasn't coming. She looked like the before photo in a story someone else would tell. She picked up the pregnancy test and held it in her palm. Then she put it in her coat pocket, walked to the closet, pulled the nearest suitcase off the top shelf, and started packing. She wasn't thinking clearly, and she knew it. That was fine. Clarity was overrated. Clarity was the thing that had kept her standing next to Adrian Cross at charity galas for 3 years, smiling at people whose names she couldn't remember, making small talk about foundation dinners and quarterly portfolios and the kind of life that looked magnificent from the outside and felt like living inside a photograph. Beautiful, flat, and completely airless. She packed what mattered. A week of clothes, her laptop, the external hard drive she kept locked in a fireproof box in the back of the closet. The one Adrian had never asked about because Adrian had never thought to ask about anything she kept for herself. Her mother's ring, a folder of documents, her own bank account information, the account she'd kept in her name only since the first year, the one she'd funded quietly, methodically, because some small part of her had always known. She dragged the suitcase to the elevator and pressed the lobby button and watched the floors count down and told herself she was not going to cry until she was outside. She made it to the sidewalk. The rain hit her in the same moment the crying did, and she stood there on 57th Street in the blue silk dress getting soaked while yellow cabs slid past and a man in a doorman uniform pretended not to see her, and she let herself have exactly 90 seconds of it. The shaking, the pressure behind her eyes, the specific humiliation of realizing that the man who had stood across from her at an altar had been planning this exit the way you plan a business restructuring, cleanly and without sentiment, and then she picked up the suitcase and started walking. She had no destination. That was fine too. She just needed to be in motion. The restaurant appeared the way things appear when you're not looking for them. It was on a side street off 5th, sandwiched between a closed jewelry shop and a parking garage, with a hand-painted sign above the door that read DeLuca's in dark gold lettering that had started to peel at the edges. The windows were fogged from the inside. Through the glass, she could see candles and dark wood and the suggestion of warmth, and she stood outside with rain soaking through her coat and thought, 1 hour. Just sit somewhere dry for 1 hour. She pushed through the door. The inside was quieter than she expected. Small tables, white linens, a bar along the left wall with bottles arranged with the kind of care that suggested someone actually thought about it. Maybe a dozen people eating. Soft music, not piped in, she realized, but from an actual man in the corner with an actual guitar, playing something low and unhurried. A hostess appeared, looked at Evelyn's wet hair and her expensive ruined dress and the suitcase she was dragging, and to her credit said nothing except, "One?" "Just a seat somewhere," Evelyn said. "Anywhere." She was seated in this corner near the window, with a candle that had burned down halfway and a menu she didn't open. She ordered whatever the house wine was, and then changed her mind and asked for water, still, and then sat with her coat on and her hands flat on the table and let the warmth of the room slowly work its way back into her. She'd been sitting there for maybe 15 minutes when she became aware that someone was looking at her. Not the uncomfortable kind of looking. Not predatory. More the way someone looks at a thing that has caught their attention and they're not yet sure why. She looked up. The man was standing near the bar, not sitting at it, holding a glass of something amber, with the ease of someone who owned the glass and probably also owned the bar. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed, with dark hair going slightly silver at the temples and a face that had seen enough that it had stopped performing for people. He was dressed simply, dark suit, open collar, and he was not looking at her the way men at charity galas looked at her, which was with the specific assessment of something they might acquire. He was looking at her with something more like recognition, as though he had seen something in her expression that he understood from the inside. When their eyes met, he didn't look away immediately or pretend he hadn't been staring. He just held her gaze for one steady beat, and then inclined his head slightly, a small, old-fashioned acknowledgement, and looked back at his glass. She looked back out the window at the rain. 10 minutes later, the hostess appeared at her table with a bowl of bread she hadn't ordered and a small plate of something that smelled like olive oil and herbs, and said, "From the kitchen, compliments." Evelyn looked toward the bar. The man had moved. He was now seated at a table across the room with two other men, deep in conversation, his back mostly toward her. He did not look over. She ate the bread. She drank the water. She sat in the dry and the warmth for another hour and let herself think. The two men at his table were named Carlo and Dav, and they had been with Lucien DeLuca long enough that they no longer needed to perform attentiveness. They simply paid it, quietly and constantly, without making it obvious. Carlo was older, heavy-set, with the kind of stillness that came from having spent years in rooms where the wrong movement could end a conversation permanently. Dav was younger, leaner, and had the habit of watching doorways that he had never managed to break. "She's been sitting there 40 minutes, Carlo said, not looking at her. "I know," Lucien said. "You know her?" "No?" Carlo picked up his fork. "She looks like money. She looks like someone who just got the worst news of her life and is deciding what to do about it." Lucien turned his wine glass slightly on the tablecloth. "There's a difference." Dav glanced over once, quickly. "You send the bread?" "I told Marco." "She's soaked through her coat." "I noticed." Carlo looked at him sideways. "You want me to find out who she is?" "No." Lucien said it without sharpness, just finality. "Leave her alone." He meant it when he said it. But when the woman in the blue silk dress finally stood to leave, she miscalculated the suitcase and it caught on a chair leg and went sideways, and she grabbed for it, and the coat pocket caught on the chair arm and something fell out and skittered under the table. And before she could process any of it, Lucien was already there, crouching, picking up the object that had fallen. He stood. He held it out to her without looking at it. She took it fast, faster than was casual, and for a half-second their eyes were level and close, and he saw what she'd been carrying in her pocket. He didn't say anything about it. "The rain's worse than it was," he said instead, straightforward, like it was just a fact he was offering. "If you need somewhere to wait it out, you're welcome to stay as long as you want. This place doesn't close until the last person leaves." She looked at him. She was looking for the angle. He could see that. The thing under the thing. The reason. Because everyone had a reason. He was familiar with that particular calculation. He'd spent his entire adult life in rooms full of people performing kindness as currency. "Why?" she said. Direct. He respected that. "Because you came in out of the rain and you ate the bread and you're clearly not finished thinking yet." He paused. "And because no one should have to make a decision this important standing up." She blinked. Something moved behind her eyes. Not softness exactly, more like the way ice makes a sound before it cracks. "I don't know what decision you think I'm making," she said. "No." He stepped back, giving her space, because that mattered. Neither do I. That's your business. He handed her a small card, the restaurant's card, plain, with a phone number handwritten on the back in ballpoint. But whenever you figure it out, if you need anything, use that. She looked at the card. She looked at him. She put the card in her coat pocket, next to the thing he'd pretended not to see. "Thank you for the bread," she said. "Take care of yourself," Lucien DeLuca said, and he meant that too. She left the restaurant at 11:14 and walked 2 blocks before she got in a cab and gave the driver the name of a hotel she'd stayed in once for a conference and remembered as quiet and anonymous. The card was in her pocket. The test was in her pocket. The suitcase was in the trunk. She checked in under her name, Evelyn Hawthorne, not Cross. She'd never legally changed it, something she'd told herself was inertia, and now understood was instinct, and took the room key and rode the elevator to the 7th floor and sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on. She opened her laptop. She had 17 unread emails. 3 were from Philip Rask. 1 was from Adrian's personal assistant with the subject line logistics, and she didn't open it. 1 was from her own bank, a routine statement notification. She clicked it open without thinking, because it was routine, because she always checked. The account balance was wrong. Not 0, not overdrawn, just wrong. A number that was significantly, impossibly larger than it should have been, with a transaction history that showed 3 deposits over the past 6 weeks from international routing numbers she didn't recognize, totaling just under $2 million. Evelyn stared at the screen. She had not made those deposits. She had not authorized those deposits. She did not know those routing numbers, but her name was on every single one of them. Her hands were very still on the keyboard. Her breathing had gone flat and controlled the way it did when she was frightened but couldn't afford to look it. She thought about Adrian's text, next steps, an attorney who specialized in asset division, a divorce that had already been planned down to the legal contact information. She thought about the routing numbers. She thought about what it meant that someone had been depositing untraceable international money into an account in her name, quietly, incrementally, beneath the reporting thresholds, for 6 weeks. What it meant that her husband had chosen this exact moment to end their marriage and hand her off to a lawyer. She thought about the fact that she was pregnant and alone in a hotel room, and her name was currently attached to nearly $2 million she had no explanation for. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the card with the handwritten number on the back, and she held it under the bedside lamp and looked at it, and thought about the man who had pretended not to see what she was carrying, who had given her warmth and space and no demands, who had said whenever you figure it out, as though he already knew it was going to be complicated. She set the card on the nightstand. She didn't pick up the phone. Not yet. But outside, somewhere in the city that had swallowed her whole tonight, a man named Adrian Cross was making calls of his own. Calls to people whose names Evelyn didn't know, about accounts she didn't understand, about a wife who now knew too much simply by accident of existing. And the people on the other end of those calls were not attorneys. They were not patient men, and they were already moving. She did not sleep. That was the first thing. She lay on top of the hotel comforter in her coat until sometime past 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling with the particular stillness of someone whose brain has refused to stop working despite the body's complete exhaustion. And she went through it again and again. The deposits, the routing numbers, the timing, the attorney's card, Adrian's text with its clean bureaucratic language, next steps, as though 3 years of marriage were a project reaching its natural conclusion rather than a man deciding to burn down a life with someone still standing in it. At 2:40, she got up and opened the laptop again. She was not a financial investigator. She had a degree in education and had spent the first 4 years of her career teaching high school economics before Adrian had suggested, gently and persistently, that her time would be better spent supporting his career rather than pursuing her own. She had agreed because she had loved him and because she had believed him when he said it was temporary. She understood now that temporary was a word men like Adrian used the way other people used never, with complete sincerity in the moment and no intention of revisiting it. But she had a good brain, and she knew how to read numbers, and she spent the next 2 hours reading them. The deposits had come in at intervals of 18 and 21 days. The amounts were just under $10,000 each time. 42 deposits across 6 accounts, all in her name, all at different institutions, all just below the federal reporting threshold. She knew what that meant. She had taught it in a classroom once, the concept of structuring, breaking large transfers into smaller ones specifically to avoid triggering automatic reporting to financial regulators. It was textbook money laundering. She had literally taught it from a textbook. Her name was on 42 instances of it. She closed the laptop again and sat in the dark with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and breathed through her nose and thought about what a federal investigator would see when they pulled those records. They would see her name. They would see her social security number. They would see a pattern of behavior consistent with someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They would not immediately see Adrian. At 4:15 in the morning, Evelyn Hawthorne picked up the hotel phone and called the number on the card. It rang 4 times. She was already preparing to hang up, already constructing the relief she would feel at having tried and failed, at being able to tell herself she had a reason to handle this alone, when someone answered. Not Lucien. A man whose voice she didn't recognize, low and careful, that said simply, "Yes." "I need to speak with—" She stopped. She didn't actually know his last name. The card said only DeLuca's and a number. "The man who gave me this card. At the restaurant. Tonight." A pause. "Hold on." 30 seconds of silence, then Lucien's voice, and he did not sound like a man who had been asleep. "You're still at the hotel on 48th, he said. She went very still. "How do you know where I am?" "I don't." A beat. "I'm asking." She exhaled slowly. "Yes." "You find something." It wasn't a question. She noticed that. "Yes." "How bad?" She looked at the closed laptop. "Bad enough that I called a stranger at 4 in the morning." Another pause, longer this time, and she could hear him thinking. Or maybe she was projecting. Maybe she was just hearing the ambient sounds of wherever he was at this hour, and the thinking was her own. "Don't touch the accounts," he said. "Don't move any money. Don't close anything. Don't call the bank. Can you do that?" "Yes. Go to sleep if you can. I'll send someone for you at 7. "I don't know you," she said. Not an accusation, just a fact she needed to say out loud. "No," he agreed. "You don't." And then, without ceremony, "But you called anyway. So get some sleep, Evelyn." He knew her name, too. She sat with that for a moment after he hung up, turning it over. Then she lay back on the bed and closed her eyes, and against all reasonable expectation, slept. The someone he sent was a woman. Evelyn didn't know what she'd been expecting. One of the 2 men from the restaurant, probably, the heavy one or the watchful one. But the woman who knocked on the door at 7:02 was compact and somewhere around 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, and the kind of face that had decided a long time ago it was not interested in being read. She wore a dark jacket and no jewelry except a watch, and she looked at Evelyn the way a mechanic looks at a car that's been brought in with a vague complaint. Assessing, not unkind, but not warm either. "You're Evelyn," she said. "Yes." "I'm Mara." She didn't offer a last name. "You have 1 bag?" "Yes." "Good, let's go." She did not explain where they were going. Evelyn picked up her suitcase and her laptop bag and followed her down the hallway and into the elevator and through the lobby and out to a dark SUV idling at the curb with tinted windows and a driver who didn't turn around. They drove north and then across and then onto a parkway heading out of the city, and Evelyn watched Manhattan recede in the side mirror and thought about the fact that she was in a car with people she did not know, going somewhere she'd not been told, because she had called a number on a card. "Where are we going?" she asked at the 20-minute mark. "Westchester," Mara said from the front passenger seat. "Estate, private." "Whose estate?" "Lucien's." Evelyn looked out the window. The city had given way to suburbs, and the suburbs were giving way to something greener and quieter, the kind of landscape that existed to remind wealthy people that they could afford to not be in the city when they didn't want to be. She thought about what she knew about Lucien DeLuca. She thought about how little that was. A restaurant, a card, a face that didn't perform. "He owns a restaurant in Midtown," she said. It was a statement shaped like a question. Mara's expression in the visor mirror didn't change. "Among other things." "What other things?" "That's a conversation for him to have." A pause. You should know, whatever you're walking into, he didn't create it. He's just the one willing to look at it. Evelyn turned that over. You trust him. I've known him 20 years. Mara looked straight ahead. He's made decisions I didn't agree with. He's made mistakes, but I've never seen him use someone weaker than him to protect himself. That puts him ahead of most. It was a specific kind of endorsement, the kind that didn't oversell. Evelyn looked back out the window and said nothing else until they arrived. The estate was not what she'd imagined, and it was exactly what she'd imagined. Set back from the road behind a gate that opened without anyone visibly operating it, the house was large but not ostentatious. Stone and dark wood, old trees pressing close on three sides, a gravel drive that crunched under the tires in a way that felt deliberate, intentional, the kind of sound that told you exactly who was arriving and when. Two men stood near the entrance, dressed in the careful nothing of people who were paid to be present without being noticed, and their eyes tracked the SUV with the focus of people who had been trained to track things. Lucien was on the front steps. He looked different in daylight, or not different, more precise. The restaurant had given her candlelight and fog, and her own distress as filters, and in the gray morning light she could see him more clearly. The specific quality of stillness he carried, the way he stood like someone who had learned a long time ago that power didn't require movement. He was wearing a dark wool pullover and dark trousers, and he had a coffee cup in his hand, and he looked like a man who had been awake for hours. He watched her get out of the car. He didn't come to help with the bag. He didn't perform welcome. He just waited until she was close enough and then said, "You look terrible." "I got 2 hours of sleep," she said. "Come inside, there's food." She followed him through a front hall that smelled like old wood and coffee and something faintly medicinal she couldn't identify, through to a kitchen that was unreasonably large and unreasonably warm, and she sat at a wooden table that had the marks of years of use in it, while someone she didn't see yet moved around near the stove. Lucien sat across from her and put down the coffee cup and looked at her with the same directness he'd had the night before. No preamble. "Tell me what you found," he said. She told him. All of it. The deposits, the amounts, the timing, the structuring pattern, the routing numbers she'd written on the hotel notepad and brought with her. She laid it out the way she'd have explained it to a classroom, methodically, without editorializing, because she'd found that the most frightening things became slightly less so when you described them in their exact factual components. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been married to him?" 3 years. "And before that? How long together?" 2 years. 5 years. He picked up the coffee. "And you never saw anything like this before?" "No." She paused. "But I wasn't looking." He made sure of that. Lucien nodded slowly, like that confirmed something. "The routing numbers? Can I see them?" She slid the notepad across the table. He looked at the numbers for a long time without touching it, then took out his own phone and photographed it, and sent the photograph to someone without explaining who. "Adrian Cross," he said. "He runs Cross Bellamy Capital." "You know him." "I know of him. That's different." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like confirmation. "His father is Gerald Cross. Old money with newer problems. The fund has been under informal scrutiny for about 18 months. Evelyn's hands went flat on the table. "Scrutiny from who?" "Federal people. SEC adjacent. The kind of scrutiny that doesn't make the papers until it's already finished." She stared at him. "And no one thought to tell me. You were married to him." He said it without judgment, just as a fact. In an investigation like that, the spouse is either an asset or a liability. Until they know which, they watch. The coffee arrived. Someone had put a cup in front of her without her noticing, and she wrapped both hands around it because she needed something to hold. "They think I'm part of it," she said. "They think you might be. That's not the same thing." He leaned forward slightly. "Are you?" She looked at him directly. "No." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. "Good. Then we have something to work with." Carlo did not like it. He said so at 11 that morning, in the small office off the main hallway, with the door closed and his voice at the controlled low of someone who had learned that volume was amateur. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he spoke to Lucien the way a man speaks to someone he has known long enough to be honest with, which meant without softening. "You don't know her," he said. "She shows up soaked, carrying a crisis, and you bring her here. Yes, Lucien said. That's it? Yes? What else do you want me to say, Carlo? I want you to say you've thought this through. Carlo shifted his weight. Cross Bellamy has been on the federal radar for a year and a half. If his wife is tangled in it, she's not tangled, she was used. You don't know that. I know what someone looks like when they're running a scheme, and I know what someone looks like when they've just realized they've been made a tool for one. Lucien turned from the window. She's the second thing. Carlo was quiet for a moment, then, and the other thing, the thing she's carrying. That's her business. It's connected to everything, Lucien. It means she can't run. It means she's slow. It means she's a target with a fixed position. I know what it means. Flat, quiet. So what's the plan? The plan is she stays here while we find out what those routing numbers connect to. The plan is we figure out what Cross was building before he decided to burn it down with her name on it. He picked up his own coffee. Then we'll know what we're dealing with. Carlo exhaled through his nose. And if what we're dealing with is bigger than a cheating husband with a dirty fund, then it's bigger. Lucien met his eyes. I've handled bigger. Carlo looked at him for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man who has watched someone he respects make a decision he doesn't agree with, and has decided to back it anyway. Then he uncrossed his arms. I'll put 2 more men on the perimeter, he said, and I want Dav running background on anyone she's had contact with in the last 6 months. Fine. And Lucien. He paused at the door. The woman from before. Renata. This is different from that, right? Tell me this is different. Lucien looked at the window. Outside, through the glass, Evelyn Hawthorne was sitting on a stone bench in the gray morning garden with her coat on and her coffee going cold in her hands, looking at a tree like it had said something she was still thinking about. It's different, he said. Carlo left. Lucien stayed at the window a moment longer, then went back to his desk. By 2 that afternoon, Dav had pulled enough to change the shape of what they were looking at. He spread it across the dining room table, printed pages, because Lucien had a rule about information that mattered existing only on screens, which could be wiped, and walked through it with the methodical energy of someone who had found something that surprised him, which itself was unusual because Dav was not easily surprised. The 42 accounts, he said, tapping a page, 11 different institutions, all opened in her name over a period of 14 months, starting 8 months after the wedding. Social security number matches, driver's license copy used as ID, signatures notarized at 3 different offices in Lower Manhattan. Evelyn was at the table. Lucien had decided she should be. Carlo had said nothing about it, which meant he disagreed but had chosen his battles. I didn't open those accounts, she said. Her voice was steady. I didn't sign anything. No, Dav agreed. You didn't. The signatures are close, but they're not yours. There are 6 consistent tells if you know what to look for, and someone in a bank branch isn't going to catch them. Someone running a forensic comparison will. He pulled another page forward. The routing numbers you gave us, 3 of them trace back to shell entities registered in the Cayman Islands. The other 2 are Isle of Man. All 5 companies share a registered agent. Cross Bellamy? Lucien said. 1 step removed. The registered agent handles 32 other entities, 9 of which have documented ties to Cross Bellamy Capital through a chain of subsidiaries. Dav paused. It's designed to take a while to unravel. Someone built this carefully. Evelyn was looking at the pages on the table. She looked the way people looked when the abstract becomes concrete. When a fear you've been carrying in a general shapeless way suddenly acquires specific, detailed, documented form. He was planning this, she said. Not a question. Someone was, Dav said carefully. Adrian. She said it without heat, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. He was building a shield in case the federal investigation moved forward. He was making sure that when they followed the money, it ended with my name. Lucien watched her face. She wasn't wrong. She'd gotten there fast and clean, which told him something about how her mind worked when it wasn't being managed. If you'd stayed, he said, and the investigation reached the accounts, I'd have been the one answering for them. She looked up. And he'd have a divorce filing in the works showing we were already separated. I'd have no access to his defense team. I'd have no knowledge of the fund's structure. I'd be standing alone in front of a federal investigation with 42 accounts in my name and no explanation that didn't sound like lies. The room was quiet. "He's not just cheating," she said. "He was building a case against me." She pressed both hands flat on the table. "For how long?" Nobody answered because the answer on the pages was 14 months, and 14 months ago she had still believed in her marriage. The call came at 6:17 that evening. Evelyn's personal cell phone, not the hotel room, her own number. She looked at the screen and the name said Philip Rask, and she picked up because Lucien, sitting across from her, nodded once when she showed him the screen. "Ms. Hawthorne," the attorney said. He had a smooth voice, the kind built for delivering bad news in pleasant tones. "I'm glad I reached you. I represent your husband in the matter of—" "I know who you represent," she said. A small pause. "Of course. I'm calling as a professional courtesy to let you know that Mr. Cross will be filing dissolution documents on Monday morning. He wanted to ensure you had time to secure representation." That's generous of him. If Rask heard the edge, he didn't acknowledge it. "I also want to advise you, in the interest of a clean resolution, that certain financial matters will need to be addressed as part of the proceedings. Your husband's legal team has identified several accounts that—" "I'd stop there," she said. Another pause. Longer this time. "Ms. Hawthorne, I'm going to give you a piece of information, Mr. Rask, and I need you to think carefully about what it means for you professionally." She kept her voice level. She'd been taught in her first year of teaching that the most effective discipline was the kind delivered without volume. "The accounts you're referring to were opened fraudulently in my name, with forged documents, as part of a structured scheme to conceal international transfers. I have the routing numbers, the institution records, and documentation of the forged signatures. I'm currently in the process of retaining my own legal representation and will be providing all of this to federal investigators." A beat. "So when you say certain financial matters, I want to make sure you understand that the financial matters in question are going to be examined very carefully by people with significantly more authority than either of us." Complete silence on the line. "Take some time to think about your client's exposure, Mr. Rask," she said. "Have a good evening." She ended the call and set the phone face down on the table and realized her hands were shaking. Lucien was watching her. He said nothing for a moment, then, "You didn't have to do that." "I know." "It tells him you're not going to be managed." "Good." She looked at her hands and made them stop moving by pressing them together. "I'm done being managed." He studied her face. Whatever he saw there, he seemed to make a decision about it. "Dav is going to need a formal statement from you. Everything you know about the accounts, the marriage, his business contacts, anything you observed over 5 years. It'll be long." "I know. And when this moves forward, and it will move forward, your name is going to be in it. There's no version where you stay invisible." "I know that too." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking to stay invisible. I'm asking to stay standing." He was quiet for a beat. "All right," he said. "Then let's make sure you do." The call Adrian made that same evening was different in every way. He made it from his office. Not the apartment, the office, because the apartment felt compromised now, felt like a space that had been occupied by a version of himself that had miscalculated. And he made it to a number that was not in any of his device's contact lists, dialed from memory, because some communications existed only in the body. The man who answered was named Vasile, and he was based in a city that Adrian had never visited and hoped never to visit, and he handled problems that existed in the space between legal and illegal where men like Adrian occasionally found themselves standing. "There's a complication," Adrian said, "with the wife." Not a question. Adrian's jaw tightened. He didn't ask how Vasile already knew. "She's gone, and I think she's found the accounts." A silence on the line that was different from Rask's silence, denser, with more moving in it. "You assured us she was controlled," Vasile said. His accent was slight, Eastern European, and his voice was the particular flat of someone who has spent years removing emotion from language because emotion was a liability. "She was. And now she's gone and she has the numbers and she's apparently made contact with someone." Adrian stood up from his desk and moved to the window because he needed to move. "I need to know she's not going to—" "I understand what you need," Vasile said. "The question is whether you understand what it costs." Adrian looked out over the Manhattan skyline, all those lit windows, all that ordinary life continuing in complete indifference to his. "Tell me." Vasily told him. Adrian was quiet for a long time afterward. Then, fine. And the someone she's contacted, Vasily said. Do you know who? Not yet. Find out, quickly. A pause. If it's who I think it might be, if she's managed to walk into that particular situation, then this becomes significantly more complicated for everyone. Why? Vasily said a name. Adrian's hand tightened on the phone. Because he knew that name. Everyone in New York who moved in the spaces between light and shadow knew that name and what it meant and what came attached to it. How would she even, he started. These things happen, Vasily said. People find each other in unexpected ways. That is not the point. His voice went flatter. The point is that if Lucien DeLuca is now involved in your domestic situation, you have significantly underestimated the complexity of your own problem. He ended the call. Adrian stood at the window for a long time. His reflection ghosted in the glass against the city beyond it, and for the first time in 5 years, for the first time since he'd sat across from a beautiful woman at a dinner party and begun calculating how she could be useful, he felt something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter anymore. That was the thing Adrian Cross discovered standing at his office window at 8:47 on a Thursday evening, with Vasily's voice still echoing in the particular way that voices echoed when they had said something that rearranged the architecture of a situation. Fear, and not quite fear, produced identical results in the body. The tightened chest, the slowed thinking, the sudden and unwelcome awareness of one's own heartbeat. He had spent 38 years constructing a version of himself that did not experience these things. The construction was, it turned out, less solid than advertised. He called his father. Gerald Cross answered on the second ring, which meant he was awake and had been waiting, which meant he already knew something was wrong, which meant the information had traveled faster than Adrian had. She's gone, Adrian said. I know. Gerald's voice was the voice of a man in his late 60s who had spent 4 decades in rooms where weakness was currency paid to other people's advantage. It was not warm. It had never been warm. It was precise and cold and extremely competent in the way of very old machines. Philip called me an hour ago. She threatened him. She didn't threaten him. She informed him. In our business, Adrian, those are the same thing. A pause. Where is she? I don't know yet. A longer pause. The kind that carried weight. You told me she was handled. She was. And yet. Adrian pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. She found the accounts. I don't know how. She shouldn't have had access to anything that would. It doesn't matter how. Gerald's voice dropped a register, which was the only indication he ever gave that something was serious. What matters is containment. What matters is that those accounts cannot be traced back to the primary structure before we have time to collapse it cleanly. Another pause. I'm going to make some calls. Don't, Adrian said. Vasily is already... Vasily works for the organization, not for us. He works with us because it has been mutually beneficial. The moment your wife becomes a liability to them, she becomes a problem they will solve in the way they solve problems, and that solution will create 10 more problems that will come back to us. Gerald's voice was completely flat now, the tone of a man delivering a structural engineering report. I will make my calls. To people who are ours. Do you understand the distinction? Yes. Good. Stay in the office. Don't call Vasily back. Don't contact Rask until I tell you to. A breath. And Adrian, if you have any other information about where she might have gone, any contacts she might have reached out to, now is the time. Adrian looked at his reflection in the window. He thought about the name Vasily had said. He thought about whether to tell his father. He decided to tell him. The silence that followed was the longest Gerald Cross had ever produced in a phone call with his son. Say that again, Gerald said finally. DeLuca. Lucien DeLuca. Vasily thinks she may have made contact. Another silence. Then Gerald said very quietly, How? I don't know. Gerald stopped. When he spoke again, something had shifted in his voice that Adrian had never heard before. Something that was, unmistakably, the real thing that Adrian had only been approximating at the window. That changes what I'm going to do tonight, significantly. He paused. You understand what DeLuca's involvement means. Vasile said, Vasile told you it was complicated. I'm telling you it is a different category of situation entirely. Gerald's voice had gone to a place beyond cold, into something almost clinical. DeLuca does not get involved in things casually. If he has her, if he's chosen to have her, it is because he has seen something in her situation that is useful to him, or because someone has made a mistake that created an opening he decided to walk through. A breath. Either way, the accounts are no longer our primary problem. Then what is? She is, Gerald said. Not what she knows. What she can become if someone with DeLuca's resources helps her understand what she's holding. A pause. Go home, Adrian. Tonight you do nothing. Tomorrow, I'll tell you what happens next. He ended the call. Adrian stood at the window for another 3 minutes, then got his coat and left. Evelyn woke at 5:40 the next morning to the sound of voices below her window. The room she'd been given was on the second floor of the east wing, simply furnished, with a window that looked out over the side garden and a section of the gravel drive. She lay still for a moment, processing the sounds. Low, male, more than 2 voices, and then got up and stood at the edge of the window where she could see without being easily seen. There were 4 men on the drive she hadn't seen before. They were talking to Carlo, and even from this distance and this angle she could read the body language. The particular configuration of people receiving information they didn't like. Carlo had his arms crossed. One of the new men had his hands in his jacket pockets in a way that was not casual. Another was scanning the tree line with the habitual attention of someone paid to do exactly that. She watched for 2 minutes. Then she got dressed and went downstairs. Lucien was in the kitchen. He had not slept, or if he had, it had been briefly, and he was standing at the counter with coffee and a phone face up on the surface beside him, displaying something she couldn't read from the doorway. He looked up when she came in, and his expression told her, before any words did, that something had happened in the night. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He looked at her for a beat, then accepted it. "Someone ran your plates last night. Your car, it's still in the parking structure on 54th where you left it Wednesday. Someone ran the registration at 2 in the morning through a system that shouldn't have access to DMV records." She felt it in the back of her throat first, the specific dryness of adrenaline arriving without invitation. "Who? We're working on that." The access came through a private firm that does investigative work for several corporate legal departments in the city. He picked up the coffee. "One of those legal departments is Philip Rask's firm." "Adrian's attorney." "Yes." He set down the coffee. "But Rask doesn't have the relationships to run something like that at 2 in the morning. Someone with more reach made a call on his behalf." She thought about Rask's silence on the phone, the way it had gone dense with something she hadn't been able to identify. She'd assumed it was the surprise of someone caught unprepared. She understood now it had been something else, the silence of a man already reaching for another phone before she'd finished speaking. "Gerald Cross," she said. Lucien looked at her steadily. "You know the father. I met him 4 times in 5 years. Adrian kept us separate. I thought it was because Gerald disapproved of me." She paused. "Now I think it was because Gerald was the architect and Adrian was the building, and he didn't want me looking too closely at the blueprints." Something moved in Lucien's expression, a quick, involuntary thing that was gone almost before it arrived, but she'd seen it. Recognition. "You know something about Gerald Cross," she said. "Yes." "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, she sensed, but choosing his words the way someone chooses a path through a space with things in it that can be damaged by careless movement. Gerald Cross has been connected informally and without documentation to 3 different capital structures over the past 15 years that were used to move money for Eastern European organized crime. He said it evenly. Not as a knowing partner, as a vehicle. Someone who provided legitimacy and infrastructure in exchange for capital that could be explained as private investment. Evelyn stared at him. He didn't know. He chose not to know, which is a different thing. It gives him distance, but not innocence. Lucien met her eyes. The federal interest in Cross Bellamy is not only about the fund's internal fraud, it's about who the fund's money ultimately serves. She sat down. She hadn't meant to, but her legs made the decision without consulting her. She sat and put her hands on the table and stared at the grain of the wood and thought about 5 years of dinner parties and charity galas and smiling at men whose names she couldn't remember, thought about the specific texture of a life built on top of something rotten, thought about her daughter, and then stopped herself because that thought was too large to have right now in this kitchen with this man watching her face. "How long have you known about Gerald Cross?" she said. "Long enough." She looked up. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He held her gaze. "I've known pieces of it for 2 years. Dav connected the remaining pieces last night using the routing numbers you brought." Something cold moved through her. "You were already looking at them." "At the organizations they serve, yes. Not at Cross Bellamy specifically." He paused. "Your coming here accelerated things. What would have taken us months, we've pulled together in 18 hours. She held very still. "So I'm useful to you." The word landed in the room and stayed there. She watched his face to see what he'd do with it. He didn't deflect it. He didn't perform offense. He just looked at her with that steady, unadorned directness and said, "You're in danger. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. But they're both true." "Yes." A pause. "I'm not going to lie to you to make you more comfortable here. You walked in with information that matters. That's the situation." He picked up the coffee again. "What you do with that knowledge is your decision." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What happened to the last person you tried to protect?" The kitchen went very quiet. Not tense, quiet in a different way, the way rooms go quiet when something true has just been asked. Lucien set down the coffee slowly. "She died," he said. "How?" "Because I was slow. And because I trusted the wrong assessment of how much danger she was in." His voice didn't change in pitch or volume, which somehow made it worse. "I believed the threat had been neutralized. It hadn't. There was a car, on a street in Brooklyn, on a Tuesday afternoon." He stopped. She was 7 months pregnant. Evelyn didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wasn't inadequate. "Mara told me on the drive here that you don't use people weaker than you to protect yourself," she said finally. "Mara is generous." He looked at the window. "What I don't do anymore is underestimate what people are willing to do when they're cornered." He turned back to her. "Adrian Cross is cornered, Gerald Cross is cornered and significantly more dangerous. And the people whose money has been running through that fund have no interest in courtrooms or consequences. They have an interest in silence." She absorbed that. "You're telling me I'm in more danger than I understood. I'm telling you the situation is more serious than a divorce and some fraudulent accounts." He paused. "Yes." She breathed. In through the nose, out slowly, the way she'd taught herself in her first year of teaching when a classroom of 30 teenagers had collectively decided to make her life difficult, and she had needed to not show it. "All right," she said. "Then tell me everything. Not pieces. Everything." He told her. It took 2 hours, with Dav present for the technical components and Mara present because Lucien had asked her to be. And by the end of it, Evelyn had filled 12 pages of a yellow legal pad in her precise teacher's handwriting. The kind of handwriting that made information retrievable, organized, anchored to a page so it couldn't float away and become abstract. The structure was this. Cross Bellamy Capital had been used for 8 years as a layering mechanism for 3 separate criminal organizations operating across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. The money entered through a chain of offshore entities, was cycled through legitimate appearing investment vehicles, and exited as clean capital distributed to a network of shell companies in the United States. The total volume, across 8 years, was somewhere between $400 million and $1 billion, the uncertainty being a function of how many layers remained unpeeled. Gerald Cross had not built the structure. He had been recruited into it 6 years ago by a man named Brennan Holt, who had been a senior partner at a competing fund and who had died 18 months ago of what had been ruled a cardiac event at the age of 51 while staying at a hotel in Geneva. Adrian had known for 3 years. The accounts in Evelyn's name had been built as the exit ramp, the place where the liability would land if the structure collapsed. Not just to protect Adrian, to protect Gerald, to protect the organizations that needed their capital to remain untraceable. She was not a loose end. She was the designated fall. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "They were going to let me go to prison." No one in the room said anything because there was nothing to improve upon in that sentence. "For how long was this the plan?" she said. "From the account construction timeline," Dav said carefully. "We estimate the decision was made approximately 14 months ago, around the same time the federal inquiry began escalating. 14 months ago. She had been 14 months pregnant with a marriage she believed in and a husband she had not yet stopped loving, and a future she had been building in her head. School again, maybe, a classroom, eventually a family. And the man sleeping next to her had been constructing a legal structure designed to absorb consequences that belonged to him. She put the pen down on the legal pad. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the room and looked out at the gray November garden and breathed because the alternative was something she couldn't afford. Behind her, she heard Lucien say quietly to Dav, "Give us a minute." She heard chairs scrape, footsteps, the door closing. Then silence. And then Lucien's reflection appeared in the glass beside hers, standing a careful distance back, not touching, not performing comfort. "Say it," she said. "Say what?" "Whatever you're thinking, don't be careful with it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm thinking that you're holding together better than most people would, and that the part you haven't let yourself feel yet is going to hit you at some point, and I'd rather it hit you here than somewhere you're alone." She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "I trusted him." "Yes." "For 5 years." "Yes." "He looked at me every day, and he was building this." "Yes." No softening, no adjustment. Just the word, repeated, because she needed it to be real and comfortable lies would have made it less so. She stayed at the window for a long moment. Then she straightened, turned around, and looked at Lucien with an expression that was not grief and was not rage and was not the hollow shock of betrayal. It was something that had been produced by the intersection of all three and had come out the other side as something harder and cleaner. "What do I need to do?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "You need to talk to a federal prosecutor." "Okay. It won't be clean. Your name is on those accounts. Even if the forgery is proven, you will be examined, questioned, doubted. There will be a period where the narrative is that you were a participant." "I know." "And when Adrian's team realizes you're cooperating, the pressure will increase significantly, not just legal pressure." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "I said, what do I need to do? Not what's comfortable." Something shifted in his face. It was brief and he controlled it quickly, but she saw it. The particular look of someone who has just seen a thing they weren't expecting to see in a person they were still forming an opinion of. "There's a federal prosecutor named Gail Marsh," he said. "She's been building the Cross Bellamy case for 14 months. She needs a witness who was inside the structure, someone who can speak to the pattern of behavior, the financial management, the personal conduct. She needs someone Adrian trusted enough to put his name next to." He paused. "That's you." "You know this prosecutor?" "I know of her, same way I knew of your husband." A pause. "She's honest. She won't protect you from consequences you've earned, but she won't manufacture ones you haven't. That's the most you can ask from someone in her position." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Set it up." "There's one more thing." He said it carefully. "When this becomes public, and it will, a case this size does not stay quiet, your connection to me will become part of the story. The media will characterize it in the simplest way they can. You will be described as a woman who left one powerful man and immediately attached herself to another." She looked at him. "Is that what I've done?" "No." He said it without hesitation. "But that won't matter to the coverage. Let them write it." She picked up the legal pad. "Let them write whatever they want. It won't be the first time someone decided who I was without asking me." He held her gaze for another moment, and then something that might, in better light, have been the beginning of something else moved across his face and was put away again, returned to wherever it had come from. "All right," he said. "I'll make the call." The call he made was not to Gail Marsh, not first. First, he called Mara and told her to increase the perimeter to the full complement and to pull Evelyn's cell phone from the network and replace it with a clean device on a line that could not be triangulated through commercial towers. Then he called Carlo and told him what Dav had confirmed about Gerald Cross, and watched Carlo's face go through several things in quick succession: surprise, then calculation, Then the specific settling that came when a man who had spent his life measuring risk revised his estimate upward. Gerald Cross isn't just a father protecting a son, Carlo said. He's protecting the fund's backers, which means Vasilei's people. Yes. Which means this is no longer a domestic dispute with financial complications. It hasn't been that for a while. Lucien looked at the door. We need to know if Gerald has already reached out to Vasilei's organization directly. If he has, if they've decided Evelyn is a liability rather than a manageable situation, then the people coming for her won't be attorneys, Carlo said. No. Lucien picked up his phone again. Get me Brendan. Carlo's eyebrows moved slightly. Brendan was not a name that was invoked casually. Brendan was a name that meant the situation had reached a specific threshold. Lucien, Carlo said slowly, if you put Brendan on this, we're declaring ourselves. We're saying this is ours. Vasilei's people will understand what that means. Yes, Lucien said. You understand what you're starting. Carlo, he met the older man's eyes. Get me Brendan. Carlo looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who has made a separate peace with the decision he still doesn't fully agree with. Then he took out his own phone and started dialing. Lucien walked back toward the kitchen, and he was halfway down the hall when Mara appeared at the far end of it, moving with the specific controlled urgency that she only produced when something had already gone wrong. We have a problem, she said. What? She held out a phone to, not her own, a device Lucien didn't recognize, dark screened. This was found in Evelyn's coat, the one she arrived in. She paused. It's not hers. It was sewn into the lining of the left pocket. Very small. Activated. Lucien took the phone. He looked at it. It was a tracking device built into a modified burner chassis. Slim, professional, the kind of thing that required specific knowledge to construct and specific motivation to deploy. How long has it been active? He said. At least since she arrived. Mara's voice was completely flat. Possibly since she left the penthouse. Lucien looked at the device in his hand and understood, in the specific way that things become understood when abstraction collapses into fact, that someone had known exactly where Evelyn Hawthorne was for the past 36 hours, which meant every conversation in this house, every name spoken, every plan discussed, which meant they had been watched from inside. He looked up at Mara, and his voice when he spoke was very quiet, the specific quiet that came not from control, but from the other side of it, from a place past control where things were simply what they were. Who put her coat away when she arrived? He said. Mara looked at him. Dav, she said. Dav took her coat at the door. Dav had been with Lucien for 11 years. That was the first thing Lucien held in his mind, because the mind did that. It reached for the history first, the context, the accumulated weight of shared time, as though years were an argument against facts. 11 years. Dav had been 23 when Carlo brought him in, a kid from Red Hook with a forensic accounting background and a gambling debt that had given certain people leverage over him, and Lucien had bought that debt and canceled it, and offered the kid a different kind of obligation, the kind that came with loyalty rather than fear as its operating principle, or so he had believed. He stood in the hallway with the tracking device in his hand and thought about 11 years, and then he put the 11 years away and looked at Mara. Where is he now? He said. Kitchen. He was with Evelyn when I came to find you. Get Carlo, quietly. He paused. And get Evelyn out of the kitchen first. Take her to the east room and stay with her. Don't tell her why. Mara looked at him for one beat, the look of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen and was confirming she understood, and then moved. Lucien stood in the hallway for 30 seconds. He looked at the device again. It was good work. Professional. The kind of work that required access to materials that were not commercially available, which meant Dav had not improvised this. He had been prepared for this specific situation, which meant he had known Evelyn was coming before she arrived, which meant the call at 4 a.m. had been anticipated, which meant someone had been waiting for her to make exactly that call. He put the device in his pocket and walked to the kitchen. Dav was at the counter, laptop open, coffee beside it, the posture of a man doing work. He looked up when Lucien came in and his face did the thing it always did. That specific practiced attentiveness that Lucien had spent 11 years reading as competence and was now reading differently. Lucien pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, which was unusual enough that Dav's eyes moved fractionally. A tell, small and quickly controlled. "Close the laptop," Lucien said. Dav closed it. Lucien put the tracking device on the table between them. He watched Dav look at it. Watched the sequence move across his face in the half-second before it was managed. Recognition. Then the calculation of what recognition revealed. Then the decision about whether to perform confusion. He watched Dav decide that confusion was not viable and saw the moment the decision was made, the slight settling of the shoulders, the exhale that was too controlled to be natural. "Okay," Dav said. "Just that." "Okay." Lucien said nothing. He had learned in a long career of rooms like this one that silence was the most efficient instrument available. People filled it. They always filled it, and what they filled it with told you more than any question. "How long?" Dav said after 7 seconds. "Mara found it 20 minutes ago." Dav nodded. He was looking at the device, not at Lucien. "It was in the coat lining, left pocket." He paused. "I put it there when I hung up her coat." "Yes." Lucien kept his voice level. He was aware of his own pulse in a way he usually wasn't. Steady, slower than you'd expect. The particular cardiovascular response of someone operating past the emotional register in a zone that was purely functional. "Who told you she was coming?" Dav's jaw moved. "I can't." Dav. Not loud, not threatening, just final. "Who told you?" A long pause. Dav's hands were flat on the table and he was looking at them, and Lucien watched him weigh things. Loyalties against loyalties, consequences against consequences, the specific arithmetic of someone who has made a terrible bet and is now calculating whether there's any version of the next 5 minutes that ends acceptably. "A man named Sorrel," Dav said. "He reached out 6 weeks ago. He said he represented interests connected to the Cross-Bellamy investigation. He said they needed to know if any of the principals made contact with you." He paused. "He said it was protective, that they were worried about exposure. And you believed that." Dav looked up. His eyes were doing something complicated. He had the gambling records, the old ones, the debt you bought. A breath. He said if I didn't cooperate, those records would reach people who would interpret them as evidence of ongoing compromise, that you'd see them, that it would look like you'd been working against me the whole time, Lucien said. "Yes." Dav's voice had gone rough. I thought I could manage it. Give them enough to stay quiet without giving them anything that mattered. Movements, timelines, general information." He stopped. "I didn't know about the device until last week. Sorrel told me to place it on any item belonging to the woman if she arrived. He said it was just location data." "It is location data," Lucien said. "It's also been transmitting audio." The color left Dav's face in a way that was visible and immediate, like something draining. He said, "I know what he said." Lucien picked up the device and looked at it. "They know she's here. They know what we've found. They know about Gail Marsh." He set it down again. "They know about Brendan." The kitchen was completely silent. Carlo appeared in the doorway. He took in the scene, Dav's face, the device on the table, Lucien's posture, and his own face did nothing at all, which was the most frightening version of Carlo's face. "How long has it been transmitting?" Carlo said. "Since she arrived," Lucien said. 36 hours. Carlo looked at Dav with the expression of someone performing a very specific internal calculation. "Does anyone else need to be in this room right now?" "No," Lucien said. "We're going to handle this carefully. Dav is going to tell us everything he told Sorrel, everything Sorrel told him, and every contact method they used. And then we're going to figure out how much of our timeline they have and how much time we have left before they move on it." He looked at Dav steadily. Dav looked back with the exhausted, broken open expression of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally been relieved of it by the worst possible means. "I'm sorry," Dav said. "I know," Lucien said. "Tell me about Sorrel." It took 40 minutes. Lucien sat and listened without interrupting, and Carlo stood in the doorway and listened, and Dav talked with the methodical, hollowed-out thoroughness of someone dismantling a structure they built with their own hands. Sorrel had made contact through an intermediary, a message left at a gym Dav used in Midtown, hand-delivered, no digital trace. The subsequent communications had been through a single-use phone left at rotating drop locations across the city. Dav had reported general operational information. Nothing about specific ongoing investigations. Nothing about the Cross Bellamy file. Nothing about Brendan. But he had confirmed Evelyn's arrival. He had placed the device. And the device had done the rest. When Dav finished, Lucien stood up. "You're going to write down every drop location, every communication, everything Sorrel said verbatim, as best as you can reconstruct it," he said. "Then you're going to stay in this room with Carlo until I come back." Dav nodded. He looked like a man who had aged considerably in the past hour. Lucien walked out. He found Evelyn in the east room with Mara, sitting in an armchair with her legal pad in her lap and a pen in her hand, but nothing written on the page in front of her. She looked up when he came in and read his face before he said anything, and he watched her do it, watched the specific intelligence in her eyes process his expression and arrive at an approximate truth before he gave her one. "Something happened," she said. "Yes." He sat across from her. Mara moved to the far corner of the room, present but peripheral. "There was a tracking device in your coat, in the lining. It's been transmitting our location and audio since you arrived." She stared at him. Her pen had stopped moving. "They know you're here," he said. "They know about the routing numbers, the accounts, the prosecutor, everything we discussed in the last 36 hours. She was very still for a moment. Then she said carefully, "Who placed it?" He looked at her directly. "Someone inside this house." Another pause. Her jaw had set in a way that was not emotional. It was the specific physical response of someone pushing sensation aside to make room for function. "Okay," she said. "Evelyn?" I said okay. She put the legal pad on the side table. "How long do we have before they move?" He looked at her. He had expected fear, or at minimum, the visible processing of fear that most people produced when they understood that their location had been known to dangerous people for 36 hours. He was not looking at fear. He was looking at someone who had already run the calculation and come out on the other side of it. "Hours," he said. "Maybe less. They'll want to move before we can contact the prosecutor and before Brendan arrives." "Who is Brendan?" "Someone who will significantly change the tactical equation once he's here." She absorbed that. "Then we need to contact the prosecutor now, before they can stop it." "Yes." "Can you reach her directly, not through intermediaries?" "Yes." "Then do it, now, from a clean line." She stood up. "Everything I've told you, the accounts, the routing numbers, the timeline, Adrian's contact with Rask, I'll give it all again on record, tonight, however she needs it." She paused. "If my testimony is what they're trying to stop, then my testimony is what needs to happen immediately." Lucien looked at her for a moment. Then he stood. "All right, and Lucien." She held his gaze. "Whatever's happening with whoever placed that device, handle it. But don't shut me out of what's coming next. I'm not furniture. I'm the witness." "I know what you are," he said. He said it with a weight that was not about the prosecutor, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it because there was no time, and perhaps because some things required the right kind of silence before they could be spoken. He reached Gail Marsh at 7:48 that evening. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she had been expecting contact from his direction, which told him her own sources had already given her a partial picture of what the last 36 hours had produced. Gail Marsh was 44 years old, had been a federal prosecutor for 14 of those years, and had the specific telephone voice of someone who had learned to process large amounts of consequential information quickly and without theatrical response. "DeLuca," she said. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement. "I have Evelyn Hawthorne," he said. "She's willing to give a full recorded statement tonight. She has documentation of 42 fraudulent accounts constructed in her name, routing numbers tracing to Cayman and Isle of Man shells connected to Cross Bellamy, and 14 months of direct observation of Adrian Cross's financial behavior and personal conduct." A pause. "Where are you?" He gave her the address. Another pause, longer. "There are people watching that address, DeLuca, not mine." "I know." He looked out the window of the study, at the tree line where the garden ended and the darkness beyond it began. "How fast can you get here?" 90 minutes. Make it 60. She was quiet for a beat. "That bad?" 60 minutes, Marsh. I'll need 2 agents with me. That's fine. Come in from the north gate. I'll have someone meet you. He paused. And Marsh, whatever you've heard about my involvement in this, it's accurate and I'll account for it separately. Tonight is about her. A silence. Then, 60 minutes, she said, and ended the call. He was turning from the window when Carlo appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who has just received confirmation of something he was hoping was wrong. East perimeter, Carlo said. 2 vehicles on the road that runs parallel to the property line. Parked. Not moving. Been there 40 minutes. Lucien looked at him. Brendan, 20 minutes out. That's not enough. No. Carlo's voice was completely flat. It's not. He paused. There's something else. One of the men on the perimeter found a second device, not on Evelyn, on Dav's own phone, the clean one he uses for internal communications. It's been there longer than the coat device, much longer. Lucien went still. How long? He said. Based on the hardware. Carlo's jaw tightened. 8 months. 8 months. Not 6 weeks. Not since Sorrel's approach. 8 months before that, which meant Dav's story about Sorrel was incomplete or wrong or constructed to give him a limited exposure while concealing a deeper one, which meant Lucy Yen's read of the situation had been wrong, which meant the 40 minutes of careful, hollowed-out confession in the kitchen had been a performance inside a performance. Where is he? Lucien said. He was in the kitchen. Carlo paused. He's not there now. The house had 11 rooms and 4 exits and 2 staircases and an attached garage with a door to the side garden. And Lucien moved through the geometry of it in his head in under 2 seconds and identified the 3 most probable routes and was already walking. He was in the hallway between the study and the east wing when he heard the sound, not loud, but specific, the particular acoustic signature of a door that opened to outside air on a cold night. He turned left, went through the side corridor, hit the door to the attached garage at a pace that wasn't running, but was close, and came through into the garage where the overhead light was on and the side door was standing open 4 inches. And Dav was standing at the open door with his phone in his hand and his back to the room, speaking in a voice pitched low and rapid, and Lucien crossed the garage in 8 steps and took the phone from his hand and had Dav against the wall with an arm across his chest before Dav had processed that he wasn't alone. Lucien put the phone to his ear. The voice on the other end was mid-sentence. Tell him 40 minutes, not before. We need the... Who is this? Lucien said. Complete silence on the line. Then a voice he didn't recognize, measured, Eastern European, precise, said, Mr. DeLuca, we've been wanting to speak with you directly. You have 30 seconds before I end this call and you lose whatever leverage you think you have. A slight pause, almost amused. The woman is a federal witness. Whatever she tells them tonight will be used to dismantle a structure that has taken 8 years and considerable resources to build. You understand that we cannot allow that. 20 seconds. We are not asking you to do anything. We are informing you of a reality. The woman testifies. Your organization becomes the subject of a federal investigation that will make your current operations impossible. We have documentation of transactions between your accounts and 3 cross-Bellamy subsidiaries from 4 years ago. They are real transactions, Mr. DeLuca, real enough that a prosecutor like Marsh would be obligated to pursue them regardless of her current objectives. Lucien was quiet. We are not enemies, the voice continued. We are simply people with a shared interest in a specific outcome. The woman walks away quietly. The case collapses on its own. Everyone continues. A pause. Or the woman testifies, you become a federal target, and whatever you have built in 30 years comes apart in 18 months. Those are the choices. Lucien looked at Dav against the wall, at the open door behind him, at the cold air coming through it from the dark garden. He thought about Gail Marsh driving north on a parkway at this moment. He thought about Brendan 20 minutes out. He thought about a woman in an armchair with a legal pad and a pen and no more room left in her for being managed. He thought about a Tuesday afternoon in Brooklyn and a street he had not been able to drive down since. Here's what's going to happen, Lucien said. His voice was very quiet. The woman is going to testify. I'm going to stand next to her when she does. And the documentation you're describing, I'll deliver it myself to Marsh tonight, because whatever I've done, I will account for it, and that is a concept your organization has never encountered and won't know how to respond to. He paused. So bring your 40 minutes, bring whatever you've got, because what's coming back at you has been building for 30 years, and it does not negotiate with people who hurt pregnant women. He ended the call. He looked at Dav. Dav's face was the face of a man who had come to the absolute end of his options and found nothing on the other side of them. 8 months, Lucien said. Dav closed his eyes. Yes. Sorrel. Sorrel works for them. He's not a separate interest. He was the approach, the recruitment, the whole architecture. Dav's voice was barely audible. They told me it would be simple. Observation only. They said they'd never need to do anything with the information. It was just insurance. He opened his eyes. I didn't know about Evelyn until she called. I didn't know they were going to stop. Lucien stepped back. Carlo is going to take you somewhere. You're going to stay there and you're going to write down everything. Every contact, every communication, every instruction, everything. He held Dav's gaze. If what you write is complete and truthful, I'll give it to Marsh and let her determine what happens to you. If it's not, he stopped. Don't make it not. He turned and walked back through the garage into the house, and he was through the door and into the side corridor when every exterior light on the property went out simultaneously. Not a power failure. The backup generators were running. He could hear them, which meant the main feeds had been cut deliberately, which meant the 40 minutes the voice had promised was a lie, and the people currently moving through the darkness toward the north perimeter were already there, and the sound Carlo's radio made from somewhere in the east wing was not a routine check-in. Lucien moved. He went through the corridor at speed, through the main hall, up the stairs, to the east room where he'd left Evelyn, and he came through the door and Mara was already on her feet, and the room's single lamp was throwing shadows at hard angles, and Evelyn was standing in the middle of the room with her coat on and her laptop bag over one shoulder and the legal pad in her hand like she'd been ready to move the moment she heard the lights go. They're here, he said. I know. She looked at him with eyes that were absolutely clear. What do we do? From somewhere below and outside in the direction of the north gate came the sound of Carlo's voice raised in a way Carlo's voice was almost never raised, and then another sound that was not a voice at all, and Mara moved to the window and looked out and turned back and said, with the economy of someone reporting a fact, 3 vehicles, north side. Our people are holding the gate, but not for long. Lucien looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. There's a car in the south garage, he said. Mara drives. We go south, hit the parkway, meet Marsh on the road. He paused. Marsh will have federal agents with her. Once we reach her, this becomes her jurisdiction and their tactical problem. And between here and there, Evelyn said. Between here and there, Lucien said, is mine. He held out his hand. She looked at it for one beat. The beat of someone who has spent 5 years learning not to take the hand that was offered because hands that looked like help had always come with architecture underneath them. The beat of someone who was deciding right now, in this room with lights out and noise rising from the north perimeter, whether she had correctly identified the difference between a man who wanted to use her and a man who had simply decided she mattered. She took his hand. They moved. The south corridor was dark, and they went through it fast, Mara ahead with a flashlight held low, Lucien behind Evelyn with his hand at her back. Not gripping, not steering, just present. And they came through the kitchen into the garage, and the south garage door was rolling up, and the cold air came in and the car was already running. Mara behind the wheel before Lucien had the rear door open, and Evelyn was in and he was in, and the car was moving before the door closed. They came out of the drive onto the south road, and Mara accelerated without drama, smooth and fast and certain, and Lucien looked out the rear window and saw headlights appear at the estate entrance behind them. 2 sets, moving with purpose, not hiding. They're following, he said. I see them, Mara said. Parkway in 4 minutes. 3, she said, and proved it. The on-ramp came up, and they took it, and the car hit the parkway doing 90, and Lucien called Carlo's number and got nothing, called the second number and got a voice he didn't recognize saying, North gate is clear, 2 down on our side, holding. And he said, hold it, and ended the call and looked at Evelyn beside him in the dark back seat. She was breathing, controlled. Her hand was in her lap and her legal pad was in her other hand, and she had not dropped it through any of it. "You're still holding that," he said. She looked down at it. "It's evidence." He looked at her. Something that had been building in him since a rainy night in a restaurant and a woman in a blue silk dress and a pregnancy test she'd been trying to hide moved through him and settled somewhere specific, somewhere he hadn't used in a long time, somewhere that had been shut since a Tuesday afternoon in Brooklyn. The headlights behind them were still there. 2 sets, gaining. Mara said, "Contact in 90 seconds." And he understood she meant Marsh because there were headlights ahead of them now, too. Coming the other direction on the parkway, 3 vehicles with the specific symmetrical pattern of federal transport, and the 2 worlds were about to meet on this road at speed, and whatever happened in the next 90 seconds would determine everything that came after. Evelyn looked at the approaching lights ahead, and the pursuing lights behind, and then looked at Lucien and said very quietly the thing she'd been carrying since 4 in the morning in a hotel room when she'd picked up a card and made a call that changed everything. "Whatever happens, I need you to know I walked into this with my eyes open." "I know," he said, "and I'd do it again." He looked at her in the dark of the moving car, with the lights closing from both directions, and Mara's hand steady on the wheel, and the legal pad in Evelyn's hand, and the particular quality of her eyes in that moment, clear and frightened, and absolutely certain all at once. And he said the truest thing he knew how to say, which was also the most dangerous. "So would I." The vehicles converged. The federal vehicles hit their lights all at once. Blue and white strobed across the parkway in a wash that turned everything flat and sharp at the same time. And Mara braked hard and controlled, bringing them to a stop on the right shoulder while the 3 SUVs arranged themselves in a configuration that was not a welcome and was not a threat, but was something precisely between the two. A federal embrace, which felt like safety and containment simultaneously. Behind them, the 2 pursuing vehicles slowed, hesitated for 4 seconds that Lucien counted, and then pulled off at the next exit without stopping. They were gone that fast, that cleanly, which told him everything about what they were. Not soldiers, not men with ideologies, just hired logistics, the kind of people whose instructions came with specific conditions attached, and federal lights on a parkway at night were apparently outside those conditions. He exhaled. Beside him, Evelyn let out a breath that she must have been holding for 2 minutes without realizing it, a long, uneven release that she cut short before it could become something else. "Okay," she said, to no one. "Okay," Mara confirmed from the front and put the car in park. The door of the lead federal SUV opened and a woman got out who walked like someone who had stopped being impressed by urgency a long time ago. She was medium height, dark coat, hair pulled back without vanity, and she came to the passenger side of their car and tapped the glass twice with 2 knuckles. Lucien opened the door. Gail Marsh looked at him, then looked past him at Evelyn, then looked back at him with the expression of a woman doing rapid triage on a situation she'd been briefed on, but was now reading with her own eyes for the first time. "You're all right," she said. It was not quite a question. "We're all right," he said. "Good." She looked at Evelyn again. "Miss Hawthorne, I'm Gail Marsh. I know this is not the introduction either of us planned." Evelyn held up the legal pad. "I have 42 account numbers, 5 routing traces, 14 months of behavioral documentation, and the name of the man who built the forged signature infrastructure." Her voice was steady. Her hand was not entirely. "Where do you want to start?" Marsh looked at the legal pad for 1 beat. Then something moved across her face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. "Let's get off this road first," she said. They processed Evelyn's statement at a federal field office in White Plains that smelled like institutional coffee and recycled air, in a room with a recording setup and 2 agents who asked questions in the careful, methodical way of people trained to find inconsistency by accumulation rather than confrontation. Evelyn answered for 4 hours. Lucien sat outside in a hallway on a plastic chair and waited, which was the hardest thing he had done in recent memory, harder than the drive, harder than the call with the voice on Dav's phone, harder than standing in a kitchen with a tracking device in his hand and 11 years of misread loyalty on the table. Waiting was the thing he had never been good at. Action was manageable. Action had physics, had causality, had the comfort of producing outcomes directly traceable to decisions. Waiting was just time, and the things time put in front of you. He thought about the woman on the other side of the wall. He thought about what she'd said in the car. "I'd do it again." and the specific quality of her when she said it. Not defiant, not performing courage, just stating a thing she had examined and found to be true. He had known a lot of people in his life who performed courage. He could count on one hand the ones who had simply possessed it without announcement. Carlo called at midnight. The estate was clear. 2 of their people had been taken to a hospital in Yonkers. Injuries that were serious but not critical, the kind that came with a long recovery and a story they would not tell anyone outside the organization. Brendan had arrived 20 minutes after Lucian's car left the South Drive and had found the situation already resolved by the federal presence, which meant Brendan had driven 90 minutes from Brooklyn at speed for nothing, and his text to Lucian on the matter was 4 words and unprintable. There had been no casualties on the other side, which was a fact Lucian sat with carefully because it mattered, not legally, not strategically, but in the way that some accounting happened in private, in the space between who you'd been and who you were trying to become. He called Carlo back and told him to make sure the 2 injured men had everything they needed and to give their families whatever support was required without making them ask for it. Then he sat in the plastic chair and drank bad coffee and waited. Mara found him at 2 a.m. and sat in the chair beside him without speaking for a while. That was one of the things he had valued about Mara for 20 years. She understood that presence and conversation were not the same thing and that sometimes the first was sufficient. "The second device," she said eventually, "the one on Dav's phone, 8 months. "Yes." "Which means they had 8 months of internal operational intelligence." "Yes." She was quiet. Then, "How much damage?" "I don't know yet. Enough that we'll spend the next several months finding out." He looked at the wall. "Marsh will want to talk to me separately about the transactions they described on the call, the cross-referenced accounts. The ones they were going to use as leverage. They're real accounts, Mara. Real transactions. I told you, 4 years ago, before I understood what the fund was connected to, there were 3 investments that moved through vehicles I didn't know were cross-Bellamy adjacent." He paused. "I should have known. I didn't look hard enough because the return was clean and the structure seemed legitimate." He put the coffee down. "That's not innocence, that's negligence. You're going to give it to her. Everything. Every transaction record, every communication, every piece of paper that exists. Whatever she needs." He exhaled. "If I spend the next 2 years in a legal process, that's what it costs." Mara looked at him sideways. "You're serious?" "I'm tired of the other version," he said simply. "The version where I manage exposure instead of accepting it." He picked up the coffee again, looked at it, set it back down. "Renata deserved better than a man who managed exposure. Whatever comes after this, I'd rather it be built on something that can actually hold weight." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, not quite casually, "She's not Renata." "I know. She's considerably more difficult." "I know that too. She'll fight you on everything." "Yes." Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. "That's not a flaw." Mara made a sound that was not quite a laugh and looked at the wall, and they sat in companionable silence until the door at the end of the hallway opened and Evelyn came through it. She looked wrung out in the specific way of someone who has been completely empty and is operating now on structural integrity alone. Her hair had come loose at some point during the 4 hours, and she hadn't fixed it, and there was a mark on her right hand from 4 hours of writing, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who has said every true thing they know how to say and is now standing in the aftermath of it. She saw Lucien in this chair and walked to him and stopped, and he stood because sitting while she was standing seemed wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. "How are you?" he said, hollowed out. She said it without complaint, just as a descriptor. "She's going to move on the accounts this week. Full forensic review, arrest warrants for Adrian and Gerald pending the review's confirmation." She paused. "She said the forgery evidence is strong enough that my name should be cleared from the accounts within 60 days. Should be." She said the words with the particular care of someone who has learned to respect the difference between should and will. "It will be," he said. "You don't know that." "No." He held her gaze. "But I'll make sure you have every resource available to make it true, whatever that requires." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Mara, who had developed a sudden interest in something on her phone, and then back at him. "Marsh wants to talk to you," she said. "I know." She told me about the transactions, the cross-Bellamy adjacent accounts. She watched his face. You already knew she was going to come for those. Yes, and you're going to cooperate. Completely. She absorbed that. It could take years. It could cost you. Yes. He said it without elaboration, because elaboration would have been a kind of argument, and he wasn't arguing. I know what it could cost. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. Did you do it knowingly? The question was direct and had no performance in it. It was the question of someone who needed a specific truth rather than a reassuring answer, and he gave it the respect it deserved. No, he said, but I did it carelessly. And in my business, carelessly is not a defense. It's just a slightly more sympathetic form of the same mistake. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. 4. Then she nodded, once, with the specific quality of someone filing a piece of information in the place where it actually belongs, rather than the place where it would be more comfortable. All right, she said. She did not say she believed him. She did not say she forgave him, or understood or was fine with it. She said all right, which was better than all of those things, because it was real. It was what you said when you had heard a thing accurately and had decided to continue forward from where you actually were, rather than where you wished you were. He had never, in his adult life, valued a 2-syllable response more. Adrian Cross was arrested at 6:40 in the morning at his apartment in Tribeca. Evelyn was not awake when it happened. She was asleep in a temporary accommodation arranged by Marsh's office, a nondescript apartment used for relocated witnesses, on a street she didn't know in a neighborhood she hadn't visited, and she slept for 11 hours straight, the sleep of complete structural collapse. And when she woke to Mara's knock and Mara's voice through the door saying it's done, she lay on her back on the unfamiliar ceiling and breathed for a while before she got up. Gerald Cross was taken from his Upper East Side townhouse at the same time, in a separate operation, by agents who had been briefed on the specific complexity of an arrest involving a man of his status and resources, and who executed it with the thorough professionalism of people who had been waiting 14 months for this morning. Philip Rask surrendered voluntarily at 9 a.m. through his own attorney, which was the action of a man who had spent the night calculating and arrived at the conclusion that distance from his clients was now his best remaining option. Marsh told Lucien this over the phone in a tone that contained exactly no sympathy for Rask. The man named Sorrell was picked up at JFK at 10:15, attempting to board a flight to Vienna. He had a passport and a name that was not his, and a phone that he had attempted to wipe and had not wiped completely. The forensic recovery of that phone's data would, over the following months, provide federal investigators with a thread that unraveled a financial network across 9 countries, producing 31 additional indictments and an international cooperation agreement that Gail Marsh would later describe, in a press conference she gave without notes, as the most significant financial crime prosecution of the decade. Dav gave his full statement as promised. What he gave was complete. Lucien had it verified independently. And what it contained went far beyond what he'd produced in the kitchen, because the kitchen version had been a performance and the White Plains version, given to federal agents with a prosecutor present and his own legal counsel beside him, was the thing underneath the performance. It was worse than Lucien had estimated and more useful than he had hoped. And what happened to Dav afterward was a federal matter that Lucien deliberately declined to influence in either direction, because that was the cost of the decision he had made in the hallway with Mara. To let things be processed rather than managed, to trust a system he had spent 30 years treating as an obstacle rather than a structure. It was not comfortable. He had not expected it to be. The trial began 7 months later. Evelyn testified on the 4th day. She wore a gray suit that she had bought herself, with her own money, from a store she'd chosen herself, which was a trivial detail that was not trivial to her at all. She wore no jewelry except her mother's ring, which she had been wearing since the night she'd packed a single suitcase and walked out of a penthouse in the rain. She carried nothing to the stand except the organized memory of 5 years and the specific, detailed, retrievable clarity of a woman who had spent 7 months preparing for exactly this. The defense attorney for Adrian Cross was a man named Whitfield, who had been doing this for 30 years and who was very good at his job, which meant he was very good at making witnesses feel that the ground they were standing on was less solid than they believed. He was not able to do this to Evelyn. Not because she was unassailable. She made 2 small errors under Cross that she corrected immediately and without defensiveness, which was more damaging to Whitfield's strategy than perfection would have been, because perfection could be attacked as preparation and honest self-correction could not. She was unassailable because she had nothing to hide, and the particular freedom of having nothing to hide was something Whitfield's 30 years had not equipped him to counter effectively, because most of the people he cross-examined were hiding something. She was on the stand for 6 hours. She looked at Adrian once during that time, not when she was directed to, not for identification purposes, but once, at an unguarded moment when Whitfield was at his table consulting notes, and the courtroom had gone briefly quiet. She looked at the man she had loved for 5 years, and she looked at him the way you look at something you once believed in that turned out to be made of less durable material than advertised. There was no rage in it. There was no grief either, which surprised her. She had expected grief, had prepared for it, had thought she would need to hold herself together against it on the stand. What she found instead, looking at Adrian Cross in his expensive suit with his managed expression and his borrowed dignity, was a kind of clear, quiet nothing that was not coldness, but was perhaps what came after grief when grief had finished its work. She looked away and answered the next question. Lucien testified on the 7th day. He gave his testimony about the Cross-Bellamy adjacent transactions the way he gave everything, directly, without performance, with the specific quality of a man who has made a decision about what kind of person he is going to be and is now simply executing it. He acknowledged the transactions. He acknowledged the negligence. He provided, in detail, every piece of documentation he had given Marsh, and he answered every question Whitfield put to him with the same flat accuracy he'd given the prosecution. Whitfield tried to paint him as a criminal using the trial to launder his own reputation. It was a reasonable strategy and not entirely wrong, and Lucien did not dispute the characterization of his past. He disputed the implication that the truth he was telling now was therefore worth less. He said, in words that a court reporter transcribed and that appeared in 7 newspaper accounts of the trial the following morning, "What I've done in my life is my accounting. I'm not here about my accounting. I'm here about hers." The jury was out for 2 days. The verdicts came back guilty on all counts for Adrian Cross, guilty on all counts for Gerald Cross. The sentencing, months later, would produce terms that the legal commentary described as severe, which was the word used by people who had not been inside the structure those sentences were responding to. Evelyn was sitting in a courthouse hallway when Marsh came out and told her. She sat very still for a moment. Then she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and held them there for 10 seconds, not crying, just applying pressure against something internal that needed pressure applied. Then she put her hands in her lap and looked up. "What happens to the accounts?" she said. "My name. Cleared. Official notification goes out this week. The forensic report on the forged signatures is part of the public record now." Marsh looked at her with the assessment of a woman who has watched a lot of people receive verdicts and has developed a calibrated understanding of what different silences mean. "You're done with that part." Evelyn nodded. "What will you do?" Marsh said. Not standard prosecutor's small talk. A genuine question from one woman to another. The kind that acknowledged that the end of a legal process was not the end of anything else, that the machinery of a life still had to be operated by someone. "I'm going to teach," Evelyn said. "Financial literacy. There are programs, community-based, targeting families who are vulnerable to exactly this kind of exploitation." She paused. "I have some experience with the subject." Something in Marsh's expression shifted, a brief, genuine warmth that her professional face usually kept well managed. "You'll be good at it." "Yes," Evelyn said without false modesty. "I will." Lucien was on the courthouse steps. He had come out before the verdict to avoid the specific theater of visible reaction, and he was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his face in the pale November sun, which was the same pale November sun that had been present on the morning 7 months ago when Mara had brought him back inside from the window because there was work to do. The world had a habit of providing the same light for very different moments and offering no guidance on how to distinguish between them. He heard the door open behind him and heard her footsteps, which he had learned to recognize in 7 months of proximity the way you learned the specific acoustic signature of anything you paid close attention to. And he turned. She looked different than she had on the stand. She looked like someone who had just put something down that they'd been carrying for a long time and was now noticing the absence of the weight. Her face was tired and clear and a little raw around the edges, the way faces looked after they'd been honest for too long in too public a place. She came and stood beside him on the steps and looked out at the street below. The ordinary traffic, the ordinary people, the complete indifference of a city to individual reckonings, and they stood side by side without speaking for a moment. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She was quiet. Then, "Your testimony, what you said at the end." "Yes." "You didn't have to say it that way." "I know." She looked at him. The 7 months had changed the way she looked at him. Less assessment, more something that had settled into familiarity without losing its specificity, the way you looked at someone you had gotten used to without getting imprecise about. "How is the legal process?" "Your own. Long." He said it without complaint. "Marsh is thorough. It'll take another year, probably. The final structure will depend on what the full accounting produces." He paused. "I'll come out the other side of it in a different shape than I went in." "What shape?" He thought about that. "Smaller, maybe. In terms of what I operate, more visible." He looked at the street. "I've been building things in the dark for 30 years. I'm not sure I know how to build in the light yet. But I'm going to find out." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are programs. The ones I'm going to work with in financial literacy, exploitation prevention. Some of them need infrastructure, funding, not charity money, operational support." She paused. "The kind of organizational competence that comes from knowing how to build things." He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the street with the expression of someone who has thought this through independently and arrived at a position and is now presenting it as a practical matter rather than an emotional one, because she was Evelyn Hawthorne and that was how she operated. "That's what you're offering," he said. "I'm identifying a structural need and noting that you have relevant experience." She paused. "What you do with that observation is your decision." He held the side of his face very still, because what was happening inside it did not need to be visible on a courthouse steps in November in front of a city that was paying no attention whatsoever. "All right," he said. She looked at him then, and in her eyes, in that specific, clear, evaluated gaze that had looked at him for the first time across a candlelit restaurant on a rainy night and had seen something worth calling at 4 a.m, he found the thing that had been building since then, present and unperformed, and asking nothing. "I have a doctor's appointment Thursday," she said. "Routine, 22 weeks. She held his gaze. "I was going to go alone." "You don't have to," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't." The sun moved behind a cloud, and the steps went briefly into shade, and then the sun came back, and the traffic moved, and the city continued its complete indifference. And Evelyn Hawthorne and Lucien DeLuca stood on a courthouse steps in November and did not say anything else, because the things that remained to be said were not courthouse steps things. They were slower. They were the kind that required time and ordinary rooms and the specific unglamorous work of people who have survived something and are now discovering who they are in the absence of the crisis that defined them. That work was not yet begun, but they were both still standing. 14 months later, on a Thursday evening in a garden that had managed to remain green against all reasonable expectation of November, they married. There were 11 people present. Carlo, who cried and denied it. Mara, who did not cry and didn't need to deny it. 3 people from the financial literacy program Evelyn had spent a year building, who were there because they had become, in the way that people become things without formal arrangement, something adjacent to family. A woman named Sue Jin, who had been Evelyn's closest friend since graduate school and who had driven 4 hours from Philadelphia without being asked, just to be there, which was the definition of what Sue Jin was. 2 of Lucien's oldest associates, men who had known him since before he was who he'd become, and who were present for the same reason people who knew you before attended these things, because they held the record of the distance traveled. And Mara's sister, who nobody had invited but who had come anyway and brought excellent food, and was therefore forgiven immediately. The ceremony was 20 minutes long. They had written their own words separately without comparing them in advance, and the words did not match in style or length or register, but matched in the particular way that mattered, in the fact that they were both talking about the same thing, which was not romance or happiness or a specific imagined future, but accountability. The intention to remain present and honest in the difficulty of actual days. The decision to choose, repeatedly, not once. Evelyn held her daughter while she said her words. The baby was 4 months old and had Evelyn's eyes and a temperament that Mara described as formidable, which Mara meant as a compliment because Mara valued formidable over almost everything else. Lucien held her while he said his words, and the baby grabbed 2 of his fingers in her fist with the absolute, uncommitted strength of someone who has not yet learned to modulate their grip, and held on. He let her hold on. Adrian Cross wrote a letter from federal prison 11 months into his sentence. It was addressed to Evelyn. It was 3 pages in his handwriting, which she recognized from 5 years of grocery lists and signed cards and the occasional note that had felt like love and now read like evidence of a practiced performance. She sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with the letter in front of her and her coffee going cold and read it twice, straight through, without stopping. He was sorry. He said it 7 times in 3 pages, which was either sincerity or a man who had learned that repetition produced the appearance of it, and she did not have a way to know which, and she made her peace with not having a way to know. He said she had been the best part of a version of himself that he had not been capable of sustaining. She sat with that sentence for a while, because it was the most honest thing she had probably ever seen him write, and because it contained within it the specific tragedy of a man who understood his own failure clearly and had understood it too late. She put the letter on the table and looked out the window at the backyard where Lucien had been attempting, with limited success, to build a raised garden bed for the past 3 weekends, accumulating in the process a specific and comprehensive knowledge of lumber, soil composition, and his own limitations with the spirit level. She could see him from the window, crouching over the frame with the spirit level in one hand and his phone in the other, consulting something, frowning at the level, and then frowning at the phone as though one of them was lying. She turned back to the letter. She wrote her response in 40 minutes. It was 1 page. She said she accepted what he had written, not because it repaired anything or discharged anything, but because she was not interested in carrying the weight of non-acceptance into the rest of her life. And she had learned, at considerable personal cost, to distinguish between the things worth carrying and the things worth setting down. She said she hoped, genuinely, that the time he had would become something he used rather than merely endured. She said she would not be writing again, not out of anger, but because the correspondence belonged to a chapter that had closed, and closed chapters deserved to stay closed. She signed it with her name, Evelyn Hawthorne, not Cross, never Cross, the name she had held on to through all of it like a handhold on a wall she hadn't known she'd need until she was falling. She sealed it. She put it in the mail that afternoon. She never heard from him again, and she did not spend time wondering about it, because the particular freedom of a chapter genuinely closed was that you did not need to keep checking whether it had reopened. The anniversary of the night she had walked into DeLuca's restaurant in a soaked blue silk dress came on a Thursday. Lucien made a reservation at the same corner tables. The same restaurant, which had continued without pause through all of it, because restaurants were like that. They absorbed the extraordinary events of the people who moved through them and continued serving food. And they went, just the 2 of them, with the baby at home with Mara, who had insisted without being asked. They sat at the corner table, and the candle was halfway burned down the way it had been that first night, and the man with the guitar was in the corner playing something low, and they ordered what they wanted, which was different from ordering what was expected or appropriate or impressive. And they ate and talked about ordinary things. The garden bed, which was now functional and had produced 7 tomatoes and a quantity of basil that exceeded any reasonable use for it. The program, which had expanded into 3 community centers and was building toward a 4th. The baby, who remained formidable and had recently begun making a sound that Lucien believed was intentional communication and Mara believed was air and Evelyn believed was something between the 2. At some point during the meal, in the space between one thing and the next, Evelyn looked at the room around them. The candlelight, the dark wood, the people at other tables eating and talking with the comfortable unawareness of people who had no idea what had happened here once on a rainy night, between a woman with a pregnancy test in her coat pocket and a man who had pretended not to see it, and she felt something that was not happiness in the simple sense of the word, because she had learned that happiness in the simple sense was a weather condition, not a structure, and weather changed. What she felt was more like solidity, the particular weight of a life that had been built from what actually happened rather than what was supposed to. She reached across the table and put her hand over Lucien's. He turned his hand and held hers without comment, without ceremony, with the easy certainty of someone who has done this enough times that it has become a kind of language. "Thank you for the bread," she said. He looked at her across the candlelight, this man who had been feared and careful and closed and was now none of those things in the same way, who had given 30 years of his life to a version of power that asked nothing of the soul and had spent the past 14 months discovering what it costs to want more than that. He looked at her the way he looked at her now, not like something he had acquired or protected or was responsible for, but like someone he was glad, specifically and daily, to be in the same room with. "Anytime," he said. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary night, its 10,000 lit windows and its ceaseless indifferent traffic, and its rain that fell without preference on the deserving and the undeserving alike. Inside, the candle burned down another half-inch, and the guitar player shifted to something slower, and the people at the other tables continued their ordinary lives, and in the corner, a man and a woman sat together in the specific quiet of people who have already said the hard things and are now simply present in what came after. It was not a perfect life. It was not without cost or complication or the ongoing work of two people deciding every day to be honest with each other about the distance between who they were and who they wanted to be. But it was theirs. And that specific, earned, unromanticized fact was the whole of it.